They snuck that vote in on us, or the settlement in on us Friday, but we've got some historical perspective to offer you on this conversation about pensions. Good evening. It is great to have you along on this President's Day evening. We're working on President's Day here on Dan Yorke's State of Mind, and Bob Watson is here. He's the former minority leader, and, you know, we missed the rabble-rousing and the consciousness raising and the point of view articulated by the former minority leader, but he's available for the program to remind all of you about how smart he was 20 years ago on things like pensions. So I'm looking forward to his visit here this evening. In the meantime, let's get to the rundown because we've got so much that we want to get to here. They did. That's exactly what the unions did. And she doesn't even know it. Secondly, she probably ought to fire somebody on her staff. I'll explain. Following up on Friday night's very, very tough conversation, still looking for some help for the family that was here. And come on, NBC. I mean, sometimes you just try too hard. All right, let's get to it. Let's dig into the rundown this evening on things that matter or things that are on my mind. They did. They sucked her in. Here's the headline from Friday in the Woonsocket Call. When I saw this on the newsstand, I almost, I got nauseous. Finally, a pension agreement. I'm sorry, Woonsocket Call. That might be a settlement agreement by people who are not party to the real decision. You folks in the journalistic world, you've got to start thinking about the headlines you write so that the lemmings, not my viewers on this show, but the lemmings throughout Rhode Island won't think incorrectly about what's gone on here. This is an agreement on a pension reform that is between the unions and the executive branch of government. Guess who has to make the final decision? The General Assembly. And that's going to take a while. Look, this has been this has just been a mess from the very beginning. And you know, the champion of all this is Gina Raimondo, right? She's the state treasurer who in 2011 brought everybody together, was a maestro politically in creating kind of a special session, elongated session exclusively in the fall of 2011 for pension reform, citing unfunded liabilities north of $7 billion that really had us in a terrible, terrible state. She was right then. She's wrong now, but she was right then. She brought Fox, the Speaker of the House. She brought Paiva, the Senate President, in. She got Chafee to sign on to an agreement. Now, she's running for governor, and everything changes. So much so that she speaks to the union like this.
Special thank you to the folks in labor. This is hard. This was a hard process. It's a difficult issue. It's an emotional issue. Thank you. Thank you for dedicating a year or more, staying at it, and coming to this resolution, which I believe is the right resolution for your members and for all the people in Rhode Island.
Yeah, unbelievable. She doesn't know that she got sucked in here. Either she doesn't know or she's just buying into it. Look, deal passed in 2011. The labor unions didn't file a lawsuit until midway through 2012. And now we've had a year-long conversation at the behest or the suggestion now of Judge Sarah Taft Carter that runs into election year 2014, which changes the entire dynamic of Raimondo's perspective. Didn't have to. She could have simply said, you know what? I'm going to stand by the tough work that we did in 2011, let the chips fall where they may, and let a constitutional decision be made. I'll talk more with Bob Watson about this. Here's the bottom line. They got her. They strung this out. They got her. And guess what? They're not going to give anything to her at the election. So she's between a rock and a hard place. And at the end, it's going to hurt her. So is this. Not a lot, but a little. You know, if you're the treasurer and the chief fiscal officer of the state, perhaps you want someone to do a little bit of homework before you decide that you're going to announce your candidacy in this place. Here was the headline in the Journal today, Cities Wait for the Payoff. It's a really cool article that Bill Malinowski put together that talks about property taxes due in the city of Central Falls and the city of Pawtucket for what is the Hope Artiste building and the building next door. Gina Raimondo made her big kickoff. Here she is at the Hope Artiste building. And she talked all about it being the symbol of incubated economic success. And she was quite ecstatic about it. Someone should have found out before they decided to announce her gubernatorial candidacy there that they're deadbeats. on $750,000 of taxes. Now, the businesses that are incubated in there, I'm all bullish. I love that little farmers market they do on Saturday mornings. But the truth is that someone didn't do their homework. Just saying. Okay, let's move on. Next item. Just want to follow up on the Friday show real quick. Can't race through this conversation. I'm still looking for some help. Actually, got some nice email from some attorneys who heard the radio show on WPRO Friday and watched the television show here. And I have at least one lawyer that's actually said, you know what, I want to meet pro bono with the family and come up with some kind of strategy. This is about George Howland Jr., who lost his life on February 4th. Here's a short clip of the report that week.
Holland was shot to death Tuesday night in a home on Colfax Street. Police tell Eyewitness News these men, Ashner Alexis, Elaine Badame, Sedina Nadoy, and Anthony Moore, along with the 17-year-old boy, are the killers.
3 of them conspired, drove to Woonsocket to a 4th person's house where there was also a juvenile there. The 5 of them conspired together. They obtained a gun there. They drove back to the city, and that's where they committed the murder.
Here's a short excerpt from Friday night's conversation with Candace Smith, the victim's cousin, and Leah Seaton, the victim's legal guardian, aunt, and the one who's really been his mentor through ages 13 through 17. They explained the dilemma that happened during the funeral on February 10th and what it's all about. You went through the funeral procedures, the whole thing, you had the service on February 10th.
Correct.
And in the middle of the service, you found out what?
We found out that we were unable to lay George to rest.
But you actually went through all the motions that day.
Correct.
You went to the cemetery,
Yes.
right? Because you felt...
We didn't want to disrupt anyone else's giving respects to George.
The reason this has occurred is because George's natural mother, who is in jail
Yes.
for the murder of your brother,
Yes.
George's father, 5 years ago,
Yes.
got word out that she wants him cremated, correct?
Yes.
It's a heartbreaking story. Here's the thing, it needs some mediation, and one of the lawyers that contacted me says that he thinks he's got some mediation strategies that maybe at work. There's a restraining order against a Lincoln funeral home from cremating George's remains until this thing is worked out. And one can only hope. If you're a lawyer or a mediator and you think you can help us at the end of the program, our State of Mind telephone number, which is 228-1886. Call us or send me an email at stateofmind@myri.tv.com. Again, we'll put that up at the end of the show. I've since learned from the funeral home, by the way, that there was no state agency that got in the middle of this, meaning no representatives of the ACI stepped in. It was just the funeral home director's worry that the actual authority here, once a minor passes away, is the natural mother. Very, very hard. All right. We'll continue to follow up on that story. And on a much lighter note, lastly, at the Olympics, you know, Bodie Miller is a success story. What's this, 3-4 Olympics now, I think. He's 36 years of age, and he lost his brother, who's a snowboarder, during the last year. And after he earned the bronze, the NBC reporter just couldn't stop until they brought him to tears. Now, we can't use the video because NBC's got copyrights and they're pretty neurotic about it. But this poor guy, you know what this is? This is an effort to break down masculinity. Seriously. It was just absolutely over the top by NBC. So, look, knock it off, will you? Just, you know, a good interview is a good interview without pounding away at a guy until he literally breaks down. And I found my new favorite sport, by the way. That is the coolest thing in the world. Snowboard cross. My new favorite Olympic sport. Used to be the bobsled. Of course, the hockey thing wasn't so bad with the Russians falling to the Americans. Good thing we had an American referee. Anyway, that'll be a continuing saga. When we come back, he was right all along, he'll tell you. But the truth of the matter is he'll give us some perspective on this pension thing, and it needs perspective. Stay with us.
If the litigation had gone on, it would take years to resolve. Millions of dollars, years of uncertainty. I want to be able to say, when people say, is my pension secure? Yes. When people say, do we have the money to invest in the future? Yes. So this consolidates the lawsuits, gets rid of the uncertainty, and preserves the fundamental reform. It's the right thing to do. It's a practical solution. Nothing's perfect. It is a practical solution to a serious problem.
By the way, I wrote that script for her last week because I predicted that's exactly what she would tell you, and she sounds completely in control. Here's the headline from the treasurer and other folks' participation in this lawsuit settlement. Not the one in the Woonsocket Call, but a new one in the Providence Journal that hit this weekend. Bob Watson is the former state representative and state senator from East Greenwich, most popularly known as the minority leader, and since retired, and that smile on your face indicates that you're relieved not to be battling these things anymore, right?
Yeah, well, I condemn the very notion that it would take years to solve that. Whatever happened to letting a Superior Court judge make a decision? Could have taken days. Whatever happened to letting it be appealed to the Supreme Court? Are they afraid to take it up? Do they not want it? Is it a hot potato? I mean, this is something, Dan, we've been talking about for 20 years. When I got elected in 1988, we knew back then there was a pension crisis. People throughout the country knew that there was a pension crisis. There was a banking crisis at the same time, unfortunately. But in 1995, then Governor Lincoln Almond stood with a bunch of Republicans calling for a new pension system for all new hires. And that's almost a career ago.
Bob bought this is part of his archives. This like comes off the plaques and everything else on his wall, I think. No More Gimmicks was the headline in the Journal in 1995, and if you can see under the shadow there's three representatives, including Mr. Watson, standing next to Governor Almond. What happened on that particular day?
Well, very modest. Back then, you could retire at age 60 or in 28 years of service. We wanted to increase it to 62 in 30 years of service. We also wanted to cap the cost of living increase to the first 11,000. Had we done that back then, that's almost an entire employee career ago, 20 years. People work 28 years, 30 years. So 2/3 of a career in government, we could have been addressing these issues. We could have solved the pension crisis back then. And shame on labor leaders who are short-sighted and recognize that they didn't want to encumber a budget by making some difficult decisions, namely funding the pension system the way they should have. You know, labor leaders have a fiduciary duty to their members, and I believe for the last 20 some odd years, they've utterly failed their members.
See, a lot of the labor rank and file believe that the lack of putting money into the budget to cover pension costs and the like that happened during the early 90s and like is solely a General Assembly decision. It seems like there was a lot of cooperation by union leadership back then to skip a few.
Absolutely. You can't continue to create new and exotic programs and create these little micro economies of different things and little pet projects. You can't continue to shovel money into those endeavors if you have to make the hard, responsible decisions of properly funding a pension system. That we have an obligation to the people that we expect to go to work and work a living. At the end of their career, they're also entitled to get that which they bargained for. And we fail them. And I find it interesting, Gina Raimondo, you'd believe she's the first one who ever knew that we had a pension system that needed to be addressed.
Yeah, well, listen, but to her credit, I mean, while everyone knew, no one was doing much about it, and she ringleaded everybody into that 2011 special session. You got to give her credit for what she did back then.
I give her credit for recognizing the obvious. I give her credit for recognizing that which Republicans had been constantly championing, that which is responsible governance, responsible budgeting. And had we addressed these issues over the years, we wouldn't have the crisis that we have today.
But you didn't, and she did, and she led.
She led because, let's face it, this is not something that really, frankly, many elected officials want to be the ones leading the parade down the street.
So she did, she led, the votes occurred, it happened.
And many years ago, it looked like clothing, very easy to wear, but suddenly it's becoming heavier and heavier to carry into an election cycle.
When we come
and
back,
I think that's fascinating.
I want to talk more about what Bob said there at the top, which is why can't a judge make a call and the Supreme Court make a call? He's absolutely right about that. We'll talk about who ought to be saying that, like the judge and the judges, and some more of the nuances of this. You know, only Watson would get me to defend Gina Raimondo during this week. We'll be right back.
The unions have within 2 months, some of the unions have within 2 months to have a vote. And then there's a hearing on the certification and approval of the settlement in the courts, and then another 45-day vote by retirees, I believe, and then another hearing for the judge. That gets us into May before we get to the General Assembly. This is a long process, but today is a good day. I'd like to thank the treasurer. I'd like to thank all the bargaining units that worked hard, and today is a good day in the start of a long process. I am very confident it's going to end successfully.
Well, that's Governor Chafee last Friday during, as you can see behind him, he was in silhouette because the lights were off because it was a PowerPoint presentation. The Settlement Act, well, I'm sorry, the Security Retirement Act, Retirement Security Act, whatever the heck, settlement proposal. Okay.
The good governor should remind himself that there is such a thing as separation of powers.
Hello.
And I'm not sure if the governor gets to decide when the General Assembly takes matters up. Certainly not something like this, because I can only imagine, as I consider some of the rank and file members who had to make some very difficult decisions a couple of years ago. They made some tough votes.
On this.
Hurt themselves, could have lost their seats. And to be asked now to go back and readdress an issue this touchy, I think it would be irresponsible. I certainly hope that the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, thank the judiciary, the executive branch for doing what they believe to be their function, and remind themselves that they also have a duty to the people of the state of Rhode Island to stand behind some tough decisions that they made once upon a time and stand behind some responsible budgeting decisions that frankly need to go forward. And if this is something that's going to continue to be litigated in the courts, so be it. That's why we have a court system.
Well, here's the thing. This whole worry that Gina Raimondo now has about litigation is this big black hole. Look, the lawsuit is about having a constitutional decision as to whether the General Assembly has a statutory right to change the numbers up or down for a pension program.
And we do.
And of course you do.
Absolutely. There's been case law throughout the country that's touched on this. We're not the only part in the United States that's dealing with a pension crisis.
There has not been an overall state government overhaul visited in the courts. I mean, Illinois is dealing with it, we're dealing with it, and I think the national labor unions have put a lot of pressure on Rhode Island to try to keep that question from being addressed.
Exactly.
Judge Sarah Taft Carter, you mentioned though, why can't the judge? The judge kicked it herself. She asked for settlement. She went that direction. Now, who reached her? I don't know. Are you suggesting that maybe the Supreme Court has sent the message down? Psst, psst, we don't want it.
I don't know. I can't imagine anybody really wants to be the ultimate arbiter of this issue.
Oh well, it's their job.
As divisive, absolutely. As divisive as it is, it does seem more intuitive than not that you continue to stand behind what was a well-crafted piece of legislation, let it stand up to court scrutiny, and if the courts want to kick it back, then it's a decision that the General Assembly has to make. If they need to technically make technical changes to get us back to the position that we intend to stand on.
This notion that everything is going to get washed back to the old expense with a negative decision by the courts is folly. Because you know what? There's always a way to skin the cat budgetarily. You take it from somewhere else. So the whole thing has been a sham. Gina's running for governor, and all of a sudden she's a new temperate person here. She was temperate in her leadership. It's a complete sellout. Real quick. 38 studios. There's a headline last week since Bob has been, I remind you that Bob Watson was the only guy to vote no in the House that night that the $75 million was offered to Kurt Schilling stealthily, $125 million loan guarantee that we knew was in the cooker. The House and the Senate are thumbs-upping this consolidation of debtor plan. I said I understand why the lawyers want it, and it's kind of a station nightclub fire type of legal strategy. But at the end, all it does is allow the leadership that pulled that stealth move not to answer the questions that need to be asked, correct?
Exactly.
Or answered, right?
Exactly. I hope someday through litigation we're able to get closer to the action of what really happened here, because certainly I had my reasons to be in opposition to the legislation back in real time, but clearly the information was not forthcoming or meaningful.
You had the best birdie, though. You had a combination of the best instincts and the best off-the-record information to make that stand that particular night, right?
Yeah. Well,
But
because
the rest of the rank and file, all the way up to the leadership of the Democrats, didn't.
you need a healthy dose of skepticism and cynicism to go into that building and survive.
You miss it?
I miss the health care.
Even the reformed mind guys are nothing but a bunch of Rhode Island hacks.
Well, I had health care my entire adult life, so it was nice while it lasted.
Not cheap, is it?
No, not hardly.
No.
Not hardly.
Always good to see you.
Good to see you.
Your state of mind when we come back. Stay with us. We always want to know what your state of mind is. Former Representative Watson, I'm sure, gave you plenty to think about. So kick it back to us at 228-1886. Leave a voicemail, stateofmind@myritv.com. And, of course, you can Facebook post and tweet at me at Dan Yorke Show. Here are a couple of voicemails, very serious ones from Friday night's show.
She has the right to say if her son should be buried or if he should be cremated. And if it should be cremated, then that's what it should be.
And we have another gentleman who also says, guess what? Our guests Friday night are not alone.
I know what she's going through, but because I've been trying to bury my son for 8 months now. And the mother stopped me from doing it too, which she was an absentee mother in his life. Please inform her that she ain't the only one going through this. There's other people too. This all about the battle over whether George Holland Jr.'s remains should be cremated or buried. It shouldn't be a battle. It should be a conversation and a mediation and a lot of prayer. But they're not alone. I'll see you tomorrow, 7:30 on My State of Mind. Good night.